The funeral wreaths for Grace's father had not even begun to wilt when a notice of property sale was nailed to the barn door. Charles Miller stood beside it and calmly told her she had 30 days to repay a debt of $680,000. Otherwise, the entire ranch would be sold at auction. Grace did not yet know that the debt crushing her had been created after the man whose name appeared on it was already dead. She rushed into the office and tried to access the ranch's operating account. The screen displayed only one cold message: account frozen at the request of the estate administrator. Outside, 7 families who worked for the Millers were waiting for their wages. Winter was approaching, and the workers' homes were filled with children and elderly relatives who depended on the cattle operation for income. Charles placed a folder on the desk. There is still one solution. Luke Hayes is willing to purchase the debt and delay the auction if you marry him. Grace looked up sharply. Are you trading me for the ranch? Luke is a poor widower. He needs someone to care for his daughter and access to Miller land. You need time. Grace pushed the folder back toward him. Charles pointed through the window at the workers repairing a fence. You may refuse, but the cattle, their homes, and their jobs will be liquidated before winter. That is your choice. Grace used the last of her personal savings to pay part of the workers' wages in advance. When the foreman asked what she would live on, she answered only, "At least their children need food this week." That night, Grace sat in her father's office, surrounded by the smell of old wood and ranch ledgers. Inside the Bible he often read, she found a small brass key engraved with the number 214. There was no note attached. Grace placed it in her pocket, unaware of which door it would open. The next day she drove to Luke Hayes's cabin on the edge of Silver Creek. The porch needed repairs, the fence had faded, and the truck parked outside was nearly 20 years old. Luke's clothes were worn at the elbows. Everything seemed to confirm Charles's claim that the man was nearly bankrupt. An 8-year-old girl stood beside the stairs, holding a framed photograph of a blonde woman. "I already have a mother," Sophie said coldly. Grace did not move closer. "I am not here to replace her." Sophie studied her for several seconds, then turned away. Luke invited Grace to sit at the kitchen table. He read the loan documents Charles had provided, pausing over the file code and signing date. "Have you seen the original?" "No. Charles controls every document. This code structure does not match Silver Creek bank records." Grace looked at him with suspicion. "You are saying that after using the debt to force me into marrying you?" Luke froze. "I never asked you to marry me in exchange for help. Charles told me that you proposed a practical marriage arrangement." Grace stood abruptly. Once again, men had discussed her future without allowing her to know the truth. But Luke did not try to stop her. He removed a signed agreement from a drawer. "I surrender every claim to the Miller Ranch, its water rights, property, and your income. The wedding can be canceled. I will still help you ask the court to delay the auction because these records show signs of fraud." His calm response confused Grace more than any defense could have. At that moment, her phone rang. Charles informed her that the auction date had been moved forward. "If you continue hesitating, the buyers will arrive before the end of this week." Grace ended the call. If she canceled the plan immediately, Charles would know they suspected the loan and might destroy whatever records remained. Luke placed the decision in her hands. "We can continue pretending that we are following his plan while Nora preserves the land and property records. But whether you marry me is your decision." A few days later, dry leaves blew across the stone steps outside the small Silver Creek church. Luke stopped before they entered. "If you say no, we will turn around right now." Grace looked toward the workers' homes on the land her father had left behind. She was not walking inside because she had submitted to Charles, and she did not trust Luke completely after only a few conversations. She chose a temporary marriage to keep the ranch standing while they searched for evidence. "I will go through with it, but every condition must be written clearly." The ceremony was simple. After they were pronounced married, Sophie refused to take a family photograph and stood beside the picture of her late mother. Grace did not pull her closer or ask her to smile. Outside the church, Charles looked at Luke's old truck and laughed. "You just traded a dying ranch for a husband without money." On the drive home, Grace noticed a black leather envelope beside Luke's seat. It carried the embossed words, "HLC Trust, Confidential." Luke quickly placed it inside a locked compartment before she could ask about it. The old truck had just passed through the wooden gate when the radio on the dashboard came to life. "Mr. Hayes, the board is waiting for your decision regarding 47% of the privately owned land in the county." Luke immediately switched off the radio. Grace looked at him, then at the Hayes Land and Cattle Trust envelope that had disappeared inside the locked compartment. "What board?" "That has nothing to do with your loan." His answer was not a lie, but it was clearly not the whole truth. Over the next several days, Grace and Luke agreed to sleep in separate rooms and divided the household responsibilities using a calendar on the kitchen table. In front of Charles and everyone else, they acted like husband and wife. But when only Sophie was home, no one forced the girl to participate in a family she was not ready to accept. Grace returned to managing the Miller Ranch. She quickly realized that Luke understood land values, grazing laws, and water rights far better than any small rancher should. One glance at a map told him which roads were privately owned, which fences crossed protected land, and which pipelines were restricted by older agreements. One cold night, the water line serving the workers' homes burst. Luke did not call someone else to handle it. He climbed into the muddy trench with the workers, remembered every person's name, and asked about their families. When one man called him boss, Luke replied, "Tonight I am holding the same wrench you are." Grace began to see a different man beneath his quiet appearance. During a snowstorm several days later, Sophie had a nightmare. Grace heard her crying, but did not enter without permission. She sat outside the bedroom door and read from the storybook Abby had once read to her daughter. After a long time, the door opened slightly. Grace did not hug Sophie. She simply continued reading until the girl's breathing became steady again. While helping Sophie with a local history project, Grace found a photograph of Abby participating in a reading program for rural children. "Your mother should be included in your presentation," Grace said. "What she did is still part of Silver Creek's history." For the first time, Sophie's expression became less guarded. She removed the garden key from her music box and placed it in Grace's hand. "You may go inside, but this does not mean I accept the marriage." Grace closed her fingers around the key. "I understand." An unexpected call from Nora Bennett brought Grace back to the approaching threat. At the county records office, Nora spread the loan documents across a table. "The notarization date is 17 days after your father died." Nora had once questioned Charles about the irregularity. He ordered her to correct the entry date so she would not create trouble for the family. Nora refused and secretly preserved the original scanned copy. Grace remembered the small brass key marked with the number 214. At Silver Creek Bank, it opened a safe deposit box registered in her father's name. Inside were the original ranch records, a map of Silver Spring, and a letter warning that Charles had asked Grace's father to sign an incomplete loan document. He had refused. At the bottom was a document bearing the symbol of the Hayes Land and Cattle Trust. It carried Luke Hayes's signature and the title Managing Trustee. Grace returned to the cabin and placed the document in front of Luke. "You are not a small ranch owner." Luke did not deny it. He admitted that he controlled the Hayes Land and Cattle Trust. Its grazing land, ranches, and housing properties had been purchased through multiple companies to prevent speculation, stabilize rent, and protect workers. "So this cabin, the old truck, and your worn clothes are all part of an act?" "No. This was the first home Abby and I owned. The truck was the last thing we chose together before she died." Grace heard the pain in his voice, but it did not erase her sense of betrayal. "You gave me the right to decide what happened to my land, but you did not tell me the full truth about the man I was marrying." Luke accepted responsibility without using his loss as an excuse. He gave Grace access to every trust record and offered to live separately if that was what she wanted. The real confrontation occurred during the preliminary meeting for the North Peak Resort project. Victoria Shaw announced that the development required only access to Silver Spring and a road crossing land controlled by the Hayes Land and Cattle Trust. Charles still believed Luke was a poor husband who could be bought. He pulled him aside. "I will pay you enough to convince Grace to transfer the water rights." Luke refused and walked before the board. The map on the screen changed colors, revealing properties surrounding nearly the entire proposed development. "North Peak does not own a road into the project. I own it, along with every piece of land surrounding you." Victoria briefly lost her composure. Then she argued that the trust could not save the Miller Ranch if the debt was valid and the property was sold. Luke could have paid the $680,000 immediately. Grace refused. "If you pay it, a fraudulent document becomes a debt that was honored. I want to prove that this was fraud." Nora continued tracing the records and discovered that the first electronic version of the loan had been created through Victoria's office system using an expired notarization code. But the final hearing had been moved forward and would now take place in 48 hours. That evening, Sophie overheard Grace saying she might leave the cabin after the case ended. The girl did not cry. She quietly removed the garden key from Grace's pocket and returned it to the music box. The following morning, the board secretary delivered the warning. Unless Grace proved that the loan document was fraudulent at the next hearing, control of Silver Spring would still be transferred. The hearing room was packed with ranch owners, workers, local reporters, and representatives from North Peak. Victoria spoke first, accusing Grace of using her marriage to Luke to escape a legitimate debt. Charles sat beside her with a wounded expression. "I was only trying to protect my brother's legacy from Grace's inexperience." Grace did not allow Luke to speak for her. She stood before the board and presented the timeline, beginning with the day her father died, continuing through the freezing of the ranch account, and ending with the sudden appearance of the $680,000 loan. Only then did Luke stand. "I confirm that I am the managing trustee of the Hayes Land and Cattle Trust. The trust will not grant North Peak access roads, grazing rights, or permission to build water pipelines." A map appeared showing Luke's properties surrounding nearly the entire proposed resort. But Victoria remained calm. "When the Miller Ranch is seized, North Peak will control Silver Spring without needing Miss Miller's approval." At that moment, Nora Bennett approached the evidence table. She placed down a time-stamped scan of the ranch inventory created 2 days after Grace's father died. This property record lists no loan and no mortgage. The document being used to collect the debt claimed that Grace's father had signed it 17 days after his death. The notarization code belonged to someone whose license had expired 6 months earlier. A county data specialist confirmed that the first electronic file had been created through an account belonging to Victoria's office. It had been edited 3 times before being submitted to the system. Grace removed the letter from safe deposit box number 214 and read her father's words. He had written that Charles once asked him to sign an incomplete loan document, but he refused because he feared the ranch would be used to cover debts that did not belong to the family. Charles jumped to his feet. A private letter proves nothing. Nora immediately produced a record showing that Grace's father had visited the county office to ask how he could prevent someone from mortgaging the land through an old power of attorney. Victoria was offered the opportunity to withdraw the claim and accept a private investigation. She continued insisting that every irregularity was only an administrative mistake, then attacked Nora's memory. Nora did not become angry. She read each file number, scan time, and system entry. Every statement she made was confirmed by independent data. With no way left to deny the evidence, Charles admitted that he had given the records to Victoria, but claimed that she had completed them. Victoria immediately answered, "You provided the signature samples and ordered me to file everything before Grace reviewed the estate." Their alliance collapsed in the middle of the hearing. The board suspended the North Peak project, froze every transaction connected to Silver Spring, and referred the records to the county prosecutor and the state bar. The probate court temporarily removed Charles as estate administrator, canceled the auction authority, and returned control of the ranch to Grace. Luke did not need to pay the debt because the debt was declared invalid. Grace recovered her land through the truth, not through her husband's wealth. Several weeks later, Charles was charged with document fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to seize property. He faced the legal system, not Grace's revenge. Victoria was suspended from practicing law while authorities investigated the creation and submission of the false documents. North Peak withdrew from the project. Grace reorganized the Miller Ranch into a small cooperative. The 7 families received protected employment, housing, and a share of the profits. Luke placed the land surrounding Silver Spring into a permanent conservation trust and directed part of the Hayes Land and Cattle Trust's earnings toward rural schools and worker housing. One afternoon, Sophie found Grace in the old garden. "Can you help me bring my mother's garden back to life?" They planted a new row of flowers, but kept the apple tree Abby had planted. Grace did not try to make the garden her own. She only helped what Abby had left behind continue growing. After the crisis ended, Luke placed a signed, uncontested divorce petition in front of Grace. "This marriage is no longer necessary. You do not owe me land, money, or a promise to stay." Grace looked at his signature and understood that, for the first time, no one was using the survival of the ranch to make a decision for her. She returned to the Miller Ranch for 30 days. Luke did not follow her, pressure her with phone calls, or use Sophie to keep her from leaving. During their time apart, they still met at Sophie's school, cooperative meetings, and Abby's garden. There was no debt or agreement forcing them to stand beside one another. Their relationship began again as a voluntary choice. On the 30th day, Grace returned to the cabin. She placed the unfiled divorce papers on the table. "The first time I came here, I had no choice. This time, I came back because this is what I choose." Luke did not promise to use his wealth to protect her from every hardship. He simply held out his hand and waited for Grace to decide whether she wanted to take it. Sophie entered carrying the garden key. She gave it to Grace, but did not call her mom. "Can we become a family in our own way?" Grace knelt at the girl's eye level. "We will not erase anyone in order to do that." The 3 of them stood together in Abby's garden. In the distance, the Miller and Hayes fields were no longer divided by conspiracy, but their legal boundaries remained clear, just like the love growing between them. It was built on respect, not ownership. Grace had entered the marriage to save a ranch. She stayed because she had finally found a man who did not want to own her land, her money, or the right to decide her life. What would you have done in Grace's place? After learning that Luke had hidden his true identity, could you forgive him and give the marriage a second chance? Share your thoughts and continue following Stewart's stories of love, hope, and justice.